Hello friends, Martin here and welcome to this first behind the scenes video. If you've been following this channel for a while, you probably know that I'm making a short film set in ancient Greece. And actually a few days ago I was able to release the first teaser for it. And judging by your questions, you probably wanted to know how I assembled all the scenes in Blender and also how I used the real-time renderer Eevee to render them. And that's actually what these behind the scenes videos will be all about. In it, I'll break down my blend files, some of the techniques I used to assemble them, and also how the result was animated. So let's start with one of my favorite scenes, and that's these triremes here. Triremes, if you didn't know, were a type of vessel very popular in the ancient era, right around the time my film's story takes place, which is about 490 BC. What got these triremes their name is 3 rows of oars placed on 3 levels of the ship, like you see here when I make them visible. These vessels had thus around 170 rowers, which made these ships incredibly fast and incredibly hard to operate. Anyway, there's no point beating about the bush. Most of these scenes that you can see in the teaser are actually a bit fake. Or not actually fake, but as simplified as possible to be able to make them work in real time. So this scene is actually just 3 trireme models, a tower and a sky image. Also some birds and some volumetric fog, which we will get to. But first off, let's have a look at the ship model. I actually wanted to buy a model of a trireme for my project, but then one day I started modeling and kept at it until I finally realized I finished my asset. So this is a model I'm fairly proud of, still not completely finished, but getting there. Good enough for shots like these though. I will probably do a separate course on how I modeled this asset, but it was all pretty simple, hard surface modeling, no fancy stuff. I just gathered a lot of reference and then used a lot of boxes, adjusting them into the shape of a trireme. Probably the most difficult part was how to divide and assemble all the parts into UV regions. Then I started several times and always realized I'll probably need more UV regions to get more details into the textures. By the way, you can learn how I do this in my Modeling a Spartan Warrior course. So definitely check that one out if you haven't already. Alright, plug is over. When I had my finished asset, I jumped into Substance Painter and started texturing. You can see that I've created 7 UV regions for 7 texture sets. I made some for the hull, some for the sails, oars and the bronze parts, all in 4K resolution so that I could achieve the detail I needed for the type of shot I had in mind for this trireme. Then I created some wood materials. I used some planks from Substance Source library and added some grunge and color layers to overlay those. The bronze material I created pretty much the same way as I showed you in my pedestal video tutorial, or you can wait and get a more advanced version when I release my upcoming Spartan texturing course. And as you can see, some of my layers are a mess, nothing's named properly. Well, that's what happens when I don't record my work for a tutorial. So don't do that, name your stuff. For the sails, I've used this awesome algorithmic material called padded wall. Yes, this was intended for some sort of cloth covering a wall, but I think it pretty much works for these sails as well. You can download it again from Substance Source. Cool, back to Blender now. After I exported my textures, I applied them using the same BSDF principled shader structure that I've showed you in most of my tutorials, for example the part 8 of the pedestal tutorial. Then came the more difficult part for me, how to make these ships and the whole shot move. So I first established my camera position, I created it, hit Shift F and started flying around the model, trying to figure out which angle would be the best. After I found the shot, I created an empty object, parented the camera to it, and added some movement keys. I found it better to create these empty objects for moving my cameras, because if you're keying all sorts of stuff directly in your camera, you have little room for changes. When, however, you instead create several empty objects, add movement to them, you can then just take your camera, parent it to one empty. If that movement doesn't work for you, unparent it and parent it to a different empty. This way you can quickly experiment in an organized fashion without losing yourself in a mess of keyframes on your camera object. I actually parented all the parts of my trireme under this main hull mesh so that I wouldn't have to constantly be selecting the whole collection. Instead, I just needed to click on this hull and the rest moved with it. The fastest way to parent all your collection meshes under one of them is to select all objects in your collection like this, then hold Shift, unselect one of the objects, and then Shift select it again. This way the mesh you want to parent to is the last one selected. You can now hit Ctrl P and it will all become children of this last selected object indicated by these relationship lines here. And with that done, you can just move this object and all moves with it. Except my sails, because they already have cloth simulation applied to them and I would need to recache the result to have them move with the trireme. Speaking of which, let's have a look at this cloth simulation now. I've actually changed very little. I will pause a bit on my settings here, so if you want you can copy them. Important thing here was that I've created a vertex group with these corner vertices on my sails, and I've used this group to pin them to place so that the sails don't fall to the deck. When you actually have a look at the simulation, you can quickly realize this does not make sense. The ropes are actually not moving. Heck, the sails are not even connected to the mast. Well, that's one thing I decided I won't stress about, since I figured nobody would really notice. And if somebody did, well, I hope it didn't ruin the teaser for you. Well, now everybody knows. Anyway, these sorts of cheats are needed in my opinion if you're working on a video like this by yourself. You have to decide what is and is not important and always have the priority of actually finishing your videos instead of obsessing about every little detail. There's actually more ways in which this scene doesn't make sense. For example, there is no reason for the trireme to have its sail unrolled like this in a harbor, among other ships, since there is a risk the wind would probably sweep the ship into other vessels and damage them. The sails would probably be used only further from the shore, and the crew would rather use their oars to leave the harbor. But it looks cool. So yeah, as long as it's something that's not completely stupid, I decided to go for the cool instead of the ultra correct. When it comes to the sail flapping, I used some wind force fields and I varied its strength. I have one field here blowing with a constant force to the side of the sail, deforming them a little. And then I have this dynamic field aiming slightly down with one keyframe added, and on this keyframe I have added a noise modifier here in the animation editor. I made it to move randomly 25 points up and down and made the scale, or rather speed at which the noise changes, to be 25 units as well. Also, you can add some random noise to the curve by raising this random number, which makes the field more random. In the end, with both of the fields affecting the sails, it gave me this wonderful flapping animation. I did the very same thing for the overall ship movement. I keyed the rotation of the hull, to which I have previously parented all the other parts, and added noise modifier to the key with much higher scale and much lower strength so that the ship would not move so much. I just wanted some slight rotation like it's rocking on some small waves. After I was happy with the movement of the ship, I have baked the simulations again and it gave me this nice result. One thing to notice here is the fact that I defined the start of the simulation before the start of the actual scene. If you start your simulation at frame 0, the sails actually first fall down with gravity and only then start being affected by the wind and flapping in the wind. This way, if you give it some pre-computing time, your animation will start already with the sails flapping. I'll do a separate tutorial for this on my channel, so stay tuned if you're interested in this. And I think you should be, because it's a well-known fact that every time you add a flapping flag into your scene, it instantly gets at least 10 times better. Okay, now let's have a look at the rest of the scene. One more model we have here is this Lighthouse. It's actually just a simple cylindrical asset, which I have textured again in Substance Painter using some awesome algorithmic provided materials like these medieval plaster, medieval wood, and also wattle and dough. I then added a black layer with multiply blending mode, and with this particle brush I simulated some stains created by rain. These particle brushes are awesome, so definitely experiment with them. I combined various texture regions using masks, so I have masked out this region for the wood, this region for the blue cluster, and so on and so forth. Back in Blender, I put the lighthouse on its place where I wanted it in the shot, placing it far enough from camera so that the scale is apparent. This huge box here contains my volumetric light effect, with which I have achieved some atmospheric depth in my scene. What I've done is I created a box, applied a principled volume shader to it, and plugged the volume to the material output volume socket instead of the default surface socket. This way it gives the effect some depth and transparency. Then instead of density, which creates this thick fog consuming the scene lights, I gave it very low emission value instead. If you just want to create some fog in the scene to divide your foreground from the background, this is really the easiest way. One important thing, you won't see your result unless you activate this volumetric option here in the rendering tab. Another huge thing, literally huge, that I haven't talked about just yet is this sky plane that I've used in all of my scenes, creating these nice sunset environments without slowing the scene in any way. It's just a photo put into a proper distance from the center of my scene so that it doesn't appear to be moving too much, like it's very, very far away, basically like actual sky. I got these photos from the PhotoBash website. You can find them in the Dusk and Dawn collection, and they are priceless. Can't even remember how many times I've used them already, so if you don't know PhotoBash, definitely go there and buy their products. They're awesome. To add such an image plane quickly, you go into Blender Preferences, activate this Import Images as Planes add-on, and then in the Import dialog, you choose this option, Navigate to your image, and put it into the scene. Then just scale it, position it, and you have a beautiful sky plane in your scene. Of course, this is just a background sky. To actually light the scene, I also used an HDRI image. This one was from the Pro Lighting Skies collection by Blender Guru, which you can get on Blender Market. But there's all sorts of ways to get quality HDRI images on the net. For example, you can go to HDRI Haven and look there. When you have your image, you go to the Shader Editor, Worlds tab, and connect it all like this. Background node into the world surface output, your image into the background color input, and I lowered the strength to 0.2 to not have my HDRI lighting so intense. Then if you have the Node Wrangler add-on activated in the preferences, which you absolutely should, you click on your image and hit Ctrl T, which automatically gives you this setup where you can manipulate the position of your HDRI. The thing I've done the most was grabbing this Z rotation and rotating my sky dome around to place the sun where I wanted it. For the rest of the lighting, I use just regular spotlights shining from two sides, one simulating the warm sunlight, the other coming from the other side, slightly cooler and with bigger size, basically a light bouncing from the sky. I found that sun lamps don't really work well for me in Eevee, so I use just spotlights. These seem to be the least taxing for performance, and sometimes I use point lights for light sources like fire or torch. And also, I have some particle birds here, but I'll talk more about these in a separate tutorial, so stay tuned for that one as well. Now, when it comes to actual rendering, I was once again blown away by Eevee. Basically, what I saw was what I got, and I could see my final result the whole time in front of me. However, there is some stuff I've changed to achieve even better results. First thing, I have activated this ambient occlusion option, which gives you obviously the ambient occlusion or darkening of regions where different geometries are close together. That's always nice to have. Also, bloom option with these settings gives me this nice diffuse glow over my scene. I haven't used depth of field directly in this scene. Instead, I've used it later when adding some filters in After Effects, which I will show you soon. I didn't need subsurface scattering since I don't use it on these assets, and also even though I have it activated here, I didn't need the screen space reflections either because my assets aren't really reflective except for the bronze ram part here, but as you can see, checking the thing doesn't really make a difference. Great thing about Eevee is it didn't really slow down the rendering of the scene too much, so I could afford to forget having it on. Motion blur I haven't used. I actually don't like the result too much. I found it too crisp for my taste, but that's one option I have to definitely experiment with in the future. I definitely used volumetric effects, as I've already showed you. Also, I have raised the number of pixels on these cube and cascade size options, which gave me a better result at computing the real-time shadows, and I was able to achieve less noise and jagged edges thanks to it. I found that in this scene, activating the soft shadows didn't really make much difference, only slowed down the render, so I left it off. In the indirect lighting tab, all I did was hit bake indirect lighting, which saved some computing for the graphics card. I haven't really dabbled in the color management in the case of this scene, rather I relied on After Effects post-production. And that's really it. All I've done then was to raise the number of render samples to 512, and I got awesome results for something that was rendered almost in real time. The actual final render at full resolution took about an hour, but I think it's mainly due to the number of samples I've chosen, otherwise it would be faster. Still, let's be clear guys, these render times with this sort of quality, it's just amazing. To render out my result, I set the output destination here. I also defined some passes for later compositing, namely this Z pass here and mist pass as well. These give me slightly different results. Sometimes I use mist, sometimes Z pass to achieve different compositing results. Here's how I set up rendering out my extra passes. I go into the compositing tab and add a file output node. I connect my passes into this output node and then specify where to render these passes into images. In case of the Z pass, don't ever forget to add a normalize node between your render layers and file output node, otherwise you get just a white image with little depth information. And with that, I took my images and improved them a little in Adobe After Effects. You could of course use Blender for this, but I myself am a long-time After Effects user, and at this point I don't really have a need to change it. So here I have my final beauty image, how it looked in Blender, and here's the final result. I first started with adding some particles. I used the Action Movie Essentials 2 Atmosphere Pack from the legendary Andrew Kramer and his videocopilot.net. Also, I found this free slow motion big splash of water footage. I think it was on YouTube. So I added it over my footage as well. That added some nice additional layer of detail in front of the camera. To add more contrast to my scene, I added an adjustment layer and a curves effect into it, raising the highlights and lowering the shadows a bit. Then I continued with depth of field on another adjustment layer, for which I have used the camera lens blur effect. Here you can actually set a blur map where you define the depth of your scene to enable the depth of field effect. For that purpose, I have used my mist pass that you can see here. I added it into a separate comp and then defined this comp as the blur map. I also added some lens flare magic using the optical flares add-on, again by Andrew Kramer. Also, I have added more atmospheric fog here. You can do that by adding a new solid color layer. In my case, I made it yellowish orange and set its opacity to something low, like 13%. To make it invisible over the regions that are closer to the camera, I put my mist pass composition above the layer, and here I used this track matte option. Essentially what I wanted was to have the orange layer invisible on areas that are black in my mist pass. So that's easy, I just set it to Luma Matte, which does just that. On another layer, I have my Colorista plugin, adding some coloring and vignette effects. You can, however, use just the built-in Lumetri color effect for that and achieve same results. I also added some more CC vignette effect above that. I didn't really find the previous vignette intense enough. Finally, I used a product from Trapcode called Shine, overlaying it very softly over the footage. It gave me these nice warm light streaks, which if used subtly, always improve these sorts of evening shots or morning shots. And as a final layer above all that, I added some film grain, applied like you see here, most intense in the shadows, half intensity in the midtones, and least intensity in the highlights. Then you just adjust the size and intensity of it here, and you're good to go. Of course, you need to set the final output up here. Overall, I was really surprised how easy it was to set up such a scene so quickly in Blender 2.8. In total, I think that this scene assembly took no more than 5 hours. Of course, I already had all my assets prepared and some of my particles created, like the birds. Still, I'm not sure if I've mentioned it enough, but I'm blown away by Eevee and what it enables me to do. I can finally make my animations in a short time frame without the need to export anything into any sort of game engines or without the need to render everything for days, which is what I've always dreamed of. Exciting times for sure. So my friends, stay tuned for more videos and video tutorials where I'll be dissecting more of my assets and scenes. And also, if you want to support this project, you can have a look at my Patreon file and see if some of the rewards there are to your liking. For example, there's already another video like this there, available for the Hypaspis tier and above, showing you how I put together this shot from the teaser. And of course, there's much more, like free assets, high-res renders, polls, and stuff will mount up. So have a look at the page, and I'd really be eternally grateful to you if you decided to support this project. So, I hope you liked this video format, and I'd be definitely happy if you'd let me know whether you want more of these sorts of videos. Regular tutorials are of course coming soon as well. Who knows, maybe a live stream as well. Cheers to you, and see you next time, my friends. Martin out.